Hello and good evening. I'm Melisa Idris.
And I'm Sharaad Kuttan.
You're watching Consider This, the show where we want you to consider and then reconsider what you know of the news of the day. Data revealed recently that showed a reduction in the number of child marriages registered under the Malaysian Syariah Judiciary Department in the last 5 years. But do these numbers reflect the true situation on the ground when it comes to child marriage, taking into account this past year of COVID-19? Sarah Norton-Staal is the Chief of Child Protection at Unicef Malaysia. She joins us now to discuss the recently launched Unicef Advocacy Brief titled Towards Ending Child Marriage in Malaysia. Sarah, good evening. Thank you so much for joining us on the show. What do the data and statistics tell us about the situation of child marriage in Malaysia? And more importantly, what is not captured by the data regarding this issue?
Thank you very much for these questions. And as you mentioned, we recently launched an advocacy brief to end child marriage in Malaysia. And also important to note that UNICEF globally launched on Women's Day, the 8th of March, an additional report with data indicating that globally they predict that there will be a dramatic increase in child marriage because of COVID-19. I think the important thing to consider, as you already mentioned, that we do not have data in Malaysia at present to show that there's been this increase as a result of COVID. However, what we do know is that the risk factors are the drivers of child marriage in Malaysia, which include poverty, low school attendance, that those factors are increasing as a result of the pandemic. We do know that children may have dropped out of school because of poverty, because of household income challenges, because of unemployment amongst family members. And we do know that those factors can drive an increase in child marriage. Regarding the data in Malaysia, we also know that there are challenges because many marriages may not be registered, and that includes child marriages. So although we have some figures, we're not 100% clear that that tells the whole story. And we also know that because of the sensitivity of the subject, that there may be child marriages that simply aren't accurately recorded. So I think that's in terms of, yes, there was a decrease, that's over the past 5 years, that's very good, that's very important, but we're just concerned about what has happened in the past year in terms of increasing child poverty and what that might mean for increasing child marriage.
Sarah, I wonder if you could address the question of what remains a kind of contested notion that child marriages are bad. So there are clearly Malaysians who are on your side or on the side of international advocacy groups and domestic advocacy groups who like to see an end to this practice. But there are those who don't see a problem in it and see perhaps, for a variety of reasons, religious, cultural, custom, where child marriage might be seen as protective. A child in poverty, for instance, might be protected by and through the institution of marriage. I mean, these arguments remain resonant for a segment of Malaysians. Do you think we've turned the corner on winning the argument?
Okay, I've heard those arguments, and of course we do have to always listen to people, and I think that's one of the important things, that we must listen to the beliefs and opinions of others. But I think that we need to also state the facts and the evidence that we know globally and in Malaysia about child marriage. Child marriage is a violation of children's rights. I think that's very important, as enshrined in the Convention on the Rights of the Child, and Malaysia is signatory to that convention. Why is it a violation of children's rights? Because of the many risks and threats that it poses to all children. It's a health risk. Young girls who marry at an early age face the risk of maternal mortality, a farly increased maternal mortality compared to adult women who marry, and their infants also face a higher risk of death. So it's a situation of life and death. It's quite serious. And I think that we can't dismiss that fact, that reality. And I think also we know that from the study that UNICEF conducted in 2018, that the majority of girls who marry had to drop out of school early, therefore they couldn't continue their education and realize their full potential in life. Their economic opportunities are greatly diminished because of child marriage, and that's also very serious. It's a serious threat. Both boys and girls will face that economic threat.
Actually, I wanted to ask you, Sarah, is there a gender imbalance when it comes to child marriages? I mean, does it disproportionately affect girls more than boys?
Yes, it does. I mean, 90% of child marriages involve girls. So boys are still impacted, and we can't disregard that. But 90% of those who are married underage are girls. And so it is really, it's a gender issue. And I think the other issue that we have to consider is the emotional well-being of those children who marry. We know that we don't reach our full emotional and intellectual maturity until the age of 24. So really, it's these young people who are married, they're not ready for the challenges that marriage presents. And it's simply, it's a fact. It's a reality about the way that humans develop, both emotionally and physically. And it's also a fact that in child marriage, there's a greater risk of physical abuse, violence, and exploitation, much higher rates of domestic violence for those who marry very young. And they have a higher rate of separation and divorce. So frankly, if you want to look at the facts, it's all negative. There's really no good. I mean, I think culturally,
Yes, and in fact, my question is related to the ability for that argument to dominate, right? To the perspective, not to eradicate the alternative, only that we turn the corner on that discussion. But I want to ask you if you can help us understand the as you were, you said the conditions for child marriage. You mentioned poverty. So in addressing child marriage, do we first have to deal with poverty? If poverty is driving child marriages to some extent, can we address child marriage without first addressing poverty?
Okay, I believe that there's a number of drivers of child marriage and that each one is important to address. And I think that just whereas we cannot only look at the legal challenges, and if we deal with legislation, that's not enough. Dealing with poverty is certainly crucial, and certainly poverty is linked to lack of access to education, because why are children dropping out of school? Because of the additional expense. But it's also linked to issues of sexual and reproductive health, comprehensive sexuality education, making sure that children have access to age-appropriate information at school and at home. So it's the responsibility of parents and teachers, community leaders, to make sure that children have that information. Because another thing that our study showed, that the one that we did in 2018, is that those children who were married were very uninformed about the basics of sexuality and conception. They really just did not have the facts and the understanding about their bodies. And that's why they put themselves at risk. They leave themselves vulnerable and unprotected because they don't have that basic important information about sexual and reproductive health and services. They don't have access to information or services. And this is something that across the board, it's recognized. And if you look at the National Strategy Plan on Handling the Causes of Child Marriage, which Malaysia launched in 2020, it's very evident. It's one of the areas that they want to strengthen sexual and reproductive health. So it's a very multifaceted, multi-sectoral issue that has to be tackled from many angles. And it requires partners in education, in the field of community development, addressing social norms and behavior, because it is, as you mentioned, it's a cultural issue, it's embedded in tradition. And if parents and people in communities continue to accept child marriage and condone it as normal, then the practice will continue. So that's why we have to tackle it from all those angles.
Well, one thing that was really good about the report was that it provided us some data, and I think data surrounding child marriage, particularly disaggregated data, has been somewhat lacking in the past. I'm wondering how UNICEF plans to address that. I know this advocacy brief has done that, and the role of data, Sarah, in busting that myth or the common misperceptions around child marriage, that it's it is confined to a specific community or religion or race that, as you pointed out earlier, that it affects all boys and girls and ethnicity. So talk to us about how we can bridge that data gap when it comes to the issue of child marriage.
Thank you for that. Yeah, I mean, one of the areas the advocacy brief mentions is the need for more research. Although we did this study in 2018, the study faced a lot of challenges because we couldn't get comprehensive data. We couldn't get data that really gave every year 100% of the evidence about where child marriage is occurring. So we need to do more research to get even deeper into the causality and to know what regions of the country are they having particular problems, what is driving it, why are there higher rates of child marriage in certain regions or states rather than others. And that would help us to tackle the problem if we had a better understanding, if we had more evidence. So more research on child marriage is needed to get more accurate, current, and systematic data collection. It needs to be collected regularly so that we can see the change, so that we can recognize where there's progress as well as where there's challenges. And everyone wants to see the data showing there's progress. That's absolutely true. But we need to make sure that we're getting that data throughout the country and that we can see patterns and then address the problem where we understand it more directly. And again, the research needs to be done with local communities who are involved, and so that they have ownership in that research and that they feel involved and that the process is then meaningful to them.
Sarah, I want to ask you about government, because you mentioned government. Sometimes they make the right noises. Sometimes we see a rather hydra-headed like dimension of government, meaning one side of government is saying yes, end child marriage, but then we see institutional inertia as well. So your sense of the Malaysian system and whether institutional inertia is the reason why we never seem to get a solution,
No, I wouldn't say there's institutional inertia. I think that it's a challenging problem because it is very multi-sectoral, and that means that you really need to have good coordination between Ministry of Education, Ministry of Health, Ministry of Women. They each have a critical role to play, as well as obviously the NGO community, private sector. There's so many actors that need to be involved. And I do see quite a bit of energy and enthusiasm from some of those groups. I mean, we have established a group called the Technical Working Group on Comprehensive Sexuality Education. For example, it includes all of those ministries, many NGOs and CSOs, and there's agreement on the fact that we need to take action around child marriage. And I think that the challenge, though, is that every ministry has its own, shall I say, quite demanding workload. And this issue is something that I will give incredible praise to Minister of Women for launching that national strategy plan. It was a lot of work, and I think that it's very well thought out. It really does cover all the issues. And if you look at the work plan included in that, it recognizes the roles that all those different agencies have to play to support the implementation of that plan. But I think that what has happened is in the past year, during 2020, that plan was basically paralyzed because of the pandemic, and priority, naturally was given to the emergency response. And so we really weren't able to see the progress that might have been realized. I am optimistic that given the commitment expressed by the minister in our launch on Tuesday, I have confidence that we can take that forward. And I do know there's many champions amongst those different ministries, as well as amongst the NGO and CSO community. It's just a challenge because each agency has their own role and has to deal with it with in-house, and then there has to be that coordination as well.
All right. Sarah, thank you so much for speaking with us.
Thank you very much.
Thank
you for inviting me, and look forward to continuing conversation on this topic. Thank you.
Thank you for speaking with us, Sarah. We're going to take a quick break here on Consider This. We'll be back with more on this issue. Stay tuned. Thank you so much for staying with us on Consider This. I'm Melisa. Idris, with me is Sharaad, Kuttan, and let's continue our conversation about the recently launched report or UNICEF Advocacy Brief titled Towards Ending Child Marriage in Malaysia. Joining us on the show now, we have Professor Datuk Noor Aziah Awal. She's a commissioner at the Human Rights Commission of Malaysia, or better known as SUHAKAM, and she looks specifically at children's rights. Welcome to the show, Datuk Aziah. Now, we just spoke to Sarah Norton-Staal from UNICEF Malaysia, and Sarah gave a praise to the Ministry of Women for launching the National Strategy Plan in handling the causes of child marriage. Now, if I'm not mistaken, that plan was launched in January of 2020, and that was just before the change of government and also before the pandemic hit. I'm wondering, Dr. Aziah, just how much has the events of the past year or so set back the work that has been done and the progress that has been made in terms of addressing the root causes of child marriage?
Well, I think, I also congratulate the government for continuing with the National Strategic Plan to look at the issues of child marriage or the causes of child marriage. And because as soon as it was launched in 2020 in January, then they came change of government, and of course thereafter came COVID-19, and there are certain things I think which has kind of set back, and in particular because school were closed and a lot of children were not at schools, and when online teaching and learning were introduced, there are children who felt that were not able to join those because they were not able to have they can't afford to have a handphone or a laptop, and therefore they were actually left behind in terms of the school syllabus and all that. That in itself could have an effect on child marriage statistics. But the government went on with the strategic plan, set up a technical committee, and then also set up a steering committee, the steering committee is going to monitor what is happening and whether what was planned by the government to look at the causes and then how to overcome all those causes so that child marriage numbers of child marriage could be reduced, or maybe even to stop it totally. So to me, that's very important. But of course, we cannot deny the fact that with the pandemic, with MCO, a lot of things have to take priority, because government give priorities to delivering food and then making sure that people are well provided for, and at the same time also consciously looking at the statistics on child marriage. And of course, in all the states, by 2020, all the states have actually been using, especially in the Sharia Court, the SOP that was established or introduced by JKSM, and that has been, and that is something that I think is very important. And that in itself, I mean, at the Office of the Children Commissioner, I just had a consultation and a dialogue with the chief judges of the Sharia Court of all the states, and also the director of the religious department of all the states as well, looking at child marriage specifically.
So if I get you correct, there is a general consensus. We see policy continuity between two administrations, and as you mentioned just in the end of your explanation, that even the religious authorities are with this consensus about finding a way to end child marriage. Would that be correct? Is there any form of resistance? Is resistance coming from any sector of society?
Well, of course, I just had a consultation with the religious department and the Sharia Court judges, and of course I've not had the opportunity of looking at, but I also have done some work and consultation with NGO in Sabah and Sarawak, where issue of child marriage has been raised. We also receive complaints, so meaning everybody understand what is going on. Everyone would like to have a stop or to reduce the number of child marriage. We are very concerned because child child marriage actually is a violation of children's rights, in particularly female children, because once they are married, they are denied the rights to education and also right to a healthy life, or at least, being able to look after herself in terms of reproductive health issues.
Dr. Aziah, can I just follow up? Because you mentioned that you had a consultation with the Sharia courts, and you mentioned that SOPs are now being used by the Sharia courts. Glad to hear that. I'm wondering if there's too much focus on legislation, because again, whether the issue of child marriage is best addressed through the judiciary, through the legislation. I mean, can you legislate away cultural practices like child marriage?
The thing is, because at the moment it is the statistics shows that because the Sharia court still allows child marriages, and based on that, I think that's the reason why we are focusing on legislation. But I also agree that legislation is not enough. We must do a proper campaign. In fact, from my consultation, the judges and the the director of the religious department also suggested that there must be a continuous effort to do campaign awareness, and the general public, parents must actually know that child marriage is not good for their children. Child marriage robs children of their human rights to education. And this is something, I felt that it's very well received and they understand. And of course, the law is still there. It needs to be improved and enhanced. And a lot more people need to understand why we want child marriage to be stopped.
One of the things that we have learned is that poverty is often a driver for child marriage. Maybe it's a strategy for poorer families to find a way out or secure the welfare of their children by getting them married off. To what extent do you think we have really, grabbed the bull by the horns when it comes to questions of poverty? How prevalent is poverty? Poverty is driving child marriage. If we don't get rid of poverty, then this problem will persist, will it not?
Yeah, I agree. The research that we've done actually shows one of the main drivers. That's number one, economic situation of the family. And basically the children that we interviewed in that research we built on that research to have these child marriage advocacy brief, and majority of the families, their income is from 300 to 2,000 basically, and these children got married. They didn't stop. They didn't get married immediately. What happened is that they stopped going to school because their parents couldn't afford it. And what worries me, especially now during MCO, during the first phase of the MCO, and then at the end of last year, when Unicef again come out with the Family at Age report, which stated that almost half of the children that they interviewed said that these are children from B40 families in Kuala Lumpur itself, in the urban area. They actually said that we're not going back to school because we cannot cope. We don't have all the internet line, we don't have the handphone, we don't have the laptops. So that worries me, because once they stop schooling, they will then go out and find a job, which is not even many at the moment. And then they will end up in a relationship and they will end up getting married because they felt marriage is the only way to actually solve their problems of poverty. And from the interview, a lot of the children say, I got married and my husband were able, if the husband is already working, were able to help assist the family financially.
Yeah. So it was, I guess, heartening to see the progress made and the fact that this report has come out, or this advocacy brief has come out from UNICEF. But we have to remember that this was pre-pandemic, and we have to keep a close eye on this, on the issue, to see whether it's been exacerbated by the pandemic. Dr. Aziah, thank you so much for being on the show. We really appreciate your time,
pleasure.
Shedding light and your good work on this important issue. Thank you.
Thank you.
That's all we have for you on this episode of Consider This. Before we leave you tonight, just a reminder that you can get all the COVID-19 vaccine information on astroawani.com and the Astro Awani app. Thank you so much for watching the show. I'm Melisa Idris.
And I'm Sharaad, Kuttan, signing off the evening.
We will be back with you same time and tomorrow. Catch you then. Thank you.
Good night.